Hello, everybody. Welcome to our first Crowdcast Marquee Author event. Booksellers, publishers, authors, and fellow book lovers alike have joined us tonight for this special event. We're so pleased that you're here. Punching the Air is a compelling novel, and we're excited to have your help getting it into the world at this important time in our nation's history. Thank you so much to our fabulous partners at HarperCollins for helping us bring content like this to independent booksellers. I'm Carrie Obrey, and with me here is Larry Law. Together, we are the co-directors of Heartland Summer. We'd also like to shout out to Kate Scott for her instrumental help in developing tonight's event. Looking ahead, please mark your calendar for our next Marquee Author event. On July 23rd at 7 p.m. Central, we're hosting Helen McDonald, author of H is for Hawk and the upcoming Vesper Flights. We'll be in conversation with Robin Wall Kimmerer, author of Braiding Sweetgrass, which is re-releasing this fall in a hardcover special edition format. And I would like to hand it over to Larry now for his announcements.
Thank you, Carrie. Just a few things really quickly. I'm super excited for tonight's event, so I'm going to try and get through this as quickly as possible. Tonight's event will be recorded. Like Carrie said, this programming is part of Heartland Summer. So we had an education session about hosting virtual events on Tuesday of this week, and we had our first Rep Pick session on Wednesday. Both of those sessions were recorded. You will be receiving an email from us Friday, which contains all 3 presentations from this week. Those presentations will also be shared on our Heartland Fall Forum website and on our YouTube channel. I believe Kate Scott is throwing those links into the chat at the moment. We do have, from June until September, we will have ongoing education rep picks and author events. So please visit heartlandfallforum.org to see what we have going on for the rest of the year. I also wanted to mention, so this year, the Great Lakes Independent Booksellers Association and the Midwest Independent Booksellers Association merged our annual book awards into one giant award. This year, we're presenting the Heartland Booksellers Award, which will be given out this October virtually. I wanted to mention that because bookseller nominations are still open. You have until the end of the month, June 30th, to submit your nominations for books you'd like to see win the awards this year. You can visit the MEBA website to submit for MEBA books and the Glebo website to submit for Glebo books. That's all I have, so I'm going to turn it back over to Carrie, and thank you.
And I am inviting Alessandra Balzer to join us for this next part of the event. Alessandra is the editor of Punching the Air at Balzer & Bray.
Hi.
Welcome.
Oh, I'm up.
Hi,
everyone. Yes. I sound okay?
Great. Yes, you're good.
So it's such a pleasure to be here with all of you independent booksellers who are truly the lifeblood of our communities. I couldn't be more excited. As an editor and a publisher, I know how rare it is to get the chance to publish a book that you know is going to change the conversation in the industry, in classrooms, and at home. Punching the Air is such a book, and I'm so excited for you all to read it. It's a novel in verse about a 16-year-old boy named Amal, whose future is upended when he's convicted of a crime he didn't commit. It draws from Yusef's own experiences, but it's fiction. The book is incredibly powerful and gorgeously told, and it's also a story of hope. So without further ado, let's turn to the brilliant co-authors, Ibi Zoboi and Yusef Salaam.
I'm actually going to jump in for just 1 second. There were a few things we wanted to add. And that's just the housekeeping. There is a chat on the side, so everybody please chat freely throughout the event. We encourage you to use that. There's also a questions field, so please put your questions there all throughout the event. And after about a half hour of this presentation, I'll hop back on and do the Q&A. So I'll be back at that point. And I was going to share a few blurbs. We'll save those for later. We'll put those in the chat. So I will let Alessandra take it away. And actually, Larry just reminded me that there is a call to action. That's this button right here that I need to activate. And hopefully, now if you click on that button, you will be able to request a print galley of the book. So I'm now going to X out my video and put in the authors and enjoy the presentation.
Thank you. Hi, Ibi.
Hi.
Hi, Yusef. So nice to
Hey.
see you both.
Oh, great to be here. Great to be here. Yes, indeed.
So Ibi and Yusef, you actually met a long time ago. Will you tell us the story of how you met and how this came to be? Why don't you start, Ibi?
Well, I remember it, but Yusef does not. But we have some mutual friends from college, and they all confirmed that we were in the same room at the same time. But a lot has happened for Yusef since 1999. And it was at Hunter College in New York City, and he was invited to sit in on a class. It was an African Studies class. And I did not know who he was at first, but our professor did. Eventually, we all found out who he was. And at the time, he had just been released from prison, I think two years before you were released. And this was years before the true assailant came forward. And this is many years before you were exonerated. And the overall feel in the classroom, the collective knowing was that they were innocent. And there was no question about that. And I was a journalist. I was an aspiring journalist, and I wrote for the Hunter Envoy and the Shield, two of the newspapers in the college. And I really wanted Yusef's story back then. So I remember he was leaving the building, and I chased him down, and we walked from 68th Street in Manhattan all the way to Harlem, Veggie Castle. You do not remember that, I know. But we talked the whole time, and I remember the part that I remember the most was talking about the man who is currently our president, Donald Trump. And I remember that was the longest conversation, even till now, about Donald Trump that I've had. And I remember you saying something about the police department. He had the police department in his hand, something about he was responsible for you all being indicted on the crime that you did not commit. So I remember that conversation very, very well. And I ran into him again 3 years ago at the Vegas Valley Book Festival. Actually, I was invited to a professor's home with some other writers, and in comes Yusef. And I'm like, oh my goodness. And then, as they say, the rest is history.
Yusef, do you want to add anything to that? Like the second time you met?
I say, everything. There's a time in life, I would say, that all the stars align, and not only was that time a time where all of the stars aligned, but this time most certainly is a time like that as well, where we get this awesome opportunity to share our lives with the rest of the world in terms of how do we proceed forward, how do we use this experience to change things.
And we're now speaking of change. I feel like we're seeing more people interested in activism than we ever have before, and that's really exciting to see. How do you think books play a role in that? Yusef, do you want to start?
Books are coming back in a really, really powerful way. I've always experienced books through prison, and being in prison was a time where we didn't have the opportunity to just turn on TV at our leisure, watch movies at our leisure and things like that. And so we had to rely on books heavily. And the great thing about books, especially when they're written as well as this one is that it gives you the opportunity to have this movie playing in your mind about what the story is like. And so you see the characters come to life in your head. And that's the great thing about it. And of course, activism plays a huge role in that, because then you get an opportunity to connect yourself with something that is very real in either in your recent past or even further back, right? And you start hearing about stories like people who said enough is enough, people who said, I'm going to keep on dreaming and I'm going to keep on hoping and putting one foot in front of the other. And I think that collectively, as we tap back into that medium, books are the best way to do that, because it gives us the ability to have that movie playing in our minds, have the ideas formulate, and we become the heroes of those stories as well.
Mm-hmm. Ibi, do you want to add to that?
No, he said it all.
No,
Yeah,
agreed.
Mm-hmm.
I want to talk about parenthood for a second. I know you're both parents of young children, and specifically of Black boys. And I wanted to talk about Amal's mother and the important role that she plays. Can you talk about that?
So I brought my full mothering self to this book. And usually in children's literature, I think we like to make a separation between us being parents and us being authors. I think the consensus is that parents can't be objective when writing about young people. But I beg to differ. I think I was able to bring some vulnerability to Amal's character because of my proximity to my own son, who's just turned 13. I know him as a child, whereas the world may see him very different. The world does see him very differently. The world sees him as a fully mature adult. And there is a refrain in the book where Amal is pushing back against this idea that he's a man at 16. And the book opens up with his birth because he remembers seeing his birth on video. And this was me trying to say that a child was born, a child was cared for. And this child was just 16 when his life is turned around completely. And I want young readers to think about crime and punishment for children. And we all know that Black children are unfairly criminalized for the same things that children of other races do. A mistake, a heated moment has different consequences for different children. So I saw Amal as a child and I wrote him as a child. I was able to bring that vulnerability to the page. And most importantly, I listened to how Yusef talked about his mother's involvement during his trial and his incarceration. And he talks about his mother very tenderly. And I needed him, and I needed that to be on the page. And he can speak more about that himself.
Yeah. Yusef? I tell you, mothers are special. They have this awesome ability to, because they're nurturers and because they care, to be able to build you up in a way that needs to happen, especially when fathers aren't there, you know? Yeah, my mother is my shiro. She's definitely, I don't know if folks got an opportunity to see that in different pieces, different places that they've been portrayed in, like When They See Us and maybe the Central Park 5 documentary. But yeah, she's like modern day Shiro with the cape and all.
She is. She really fought for you. Incredible.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. I want to turn to hip hop now. Hip hop was an influence in both of your lives. You're both poets. And I was amazed to learn this book has so many layers to it. And there's a really interesting author's note that I encourage you all to check out. Actually, I don't think it's in the galley, so maybe that was bad of me, but you'll be able to read it eventually. Where you talk about hip hop and how the day that you went up to the mic and you actually rapped in front of people. And then I want to talk about how that relates to the poetry in the book and lyricism.
Oh my goodness. So I'll take that one, right? You know, hip hop is a new art form that's really not new. It's actually very old. It is the tool that is used by the griot or the jele. And it's really the person who keeps the history and culture in a rhythmic form, pulsating throughout the community. And I always thought of hip hop and remember hip hop being this wonderful medium that was always full of a message being in the music. And there was always music in the message, because there was times where you would just hear the person doing the song and there would be no beat behind it. It would just be a cappella. And what was cool about that was I remember there'd be so many times where we would be in what we would call ciphers, hanging out in the yards of our communities, you know, downstairs, and all listening to the radio together, all listening to that tape. You know, back then it was the tapes, the tape that you had to put the pencil in. And yeah, some of y'all may not know about that. You know, but it was that thing that we would all hear, and somebody would say, "Hold on, man, rewind that back. Did you hear the way he said that?" You know, and I was so much enthralled, and I thought hip hop was it. I still think it is the it thing, because there's so many layers to it. So many other cultures have gotten into it and been able to do wonderful things with it. But at its core, is that there's always a message in that music, and there was always music in the message. And so that moment where I had to stand up in front of the judge, in my own case, and I was asked, do I have anything to say before they sentence me? And I said yes. And I started off with the words of my hero, Malcolm X. And then I went into this rap song that kind of just laid out everything and was talking about the system and systemic issues and talking about other cases. I brought in Yusef Hawkins into the story, with Bensonhurst and things like that. Just all of these things. And it was so liberating. But for me, it was like, I thought that was the last time that I was ever going to be able to say things in public. I thought I was going to lose my life in prison. And so that was like my last stance, my last hoorah, of being able to kick it.
Yeah. Ibi, do you want to talk about the verse in the novel and the poetry and why that was important?
So when I ran into Yusef 3 years ago, actually I ran into him. I first saw him at the home of that professor, and then I saw him the next day, and I was actually shocked at what he was doing. He was selling his book of poetry, and I picked it up to see who the publisher was. And it was self-published, which is a great avenue for many people, but I knew his story. I knew the Central Park Five story. I remember it from my childhood. And this was before I even knew there was going to be a Netflix series. And I was just really, really upset and shocked that here was Yusef, who had an incredible story at 16. And here I was, a young adult author, in the midst of the conversations around social justice books and We Need Diverse books and Own Voices books. And he was self-publishing. He was selling a self-published book of poetry. And it didn't happen then. I didn't realize it then. But later on, when I approached him like, hey, can I help you tell your story? I realized that the world needed to hear his story, to know his story in the form of a YA novel, because what happened to him at 16 as a young adult. And it just was not fair that you did not already have a book and no one knew your story. And it was a no-brainer that this would have to be a novel in verse, because Yusef had a book of poetry. And I was a poet. I am a poet. I had not gotten an opportunity to write anything in verse. And Yusef's poetry is infused into the novel. And I wrote it with Yusef's worldview in mind. We had a lot of conversations. I like to think that Yusef is not necessarily a storyteller. He is a philosopher. So during our first conversations, I was like, okay, Yusef, what's going to happen in the story? Yusef would tell me an anecdote that had such a larger, broader, deeper, profound meaning and wisdom in there. And I'm like, okay, I got to take that and make it a story, all right, or a poem. So it's Yusef's worldview and my poetry and storytelling, but I could not have written it without Yusef's perspective. So when you're reading Amal, you are reading young Yusef and the way that he saw the world.
So speaking of young Yusef, who's an artist, who you're hearing yourselves talked about so much, who's an artist, it was really important that Amal be an artist in the story. And not only that, it was really important to you both that he go to a diverse art school. So can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I think that part was important, because it was also the idea / understanding that happens in all of our lives, where you want to believe the world is rosy and sweet and everything is great, and that dream that we all know that Dr. King is known for, right, is a reality, and we've made it. Like, we're there. And there's these moments where you're like, something just doesn't feel right. That was I don't know what that was, right? And you can't really capture it in word. And it's not until you get older that you realize, oh wow, racism is still alive and well. There's moments where I was being chopped down instead of being allowed to soar and become who I needed to become. And I think that is important, because in that space you get the opportunity to see the differences and how it plays itself out. you know.
Yeah. And Yusef also went to LaGuardia High School, which was formerly the Fame School. And LaGuardia, even at that time, was diverse, and it is diverse now. But just like Yusef said, even in this world where Dr. King's dream is fulfilled, there are still things happening within those spaces that let Black children know that they are not enough, that they are lesser than. And these are where microaggressions come in and subtle racism from teachers come in. And we needed Amal to be in that sort of setting for readers to know that we have not yet arrived, to let young people know, even within diversity, even within diverse spaces, even when it seems to be that we've all, come to some, agreement of how this world should be, there still needs to be work. And the world is letting us know this is the case.
Yeah.
For sure.
Oh, yeah.
So let's get nerdy and really talk about the symbolism in the book, because this book is so rich. I know it's going to be the kind of book that people are like underlining and like dog-earing and reading again and again. So Ibi, talk about the symbolism in the poems, in the titles, in the formatting. Like, give us some examples.
So yes, I wrote it. I could not have written symbolism without Yusef's perspective. Yusef is a deep thinker. I don't know if you're getting a sense of that from how he's speaking now, but one of the things he would say often while we were talking was that prison was in prison. By going to jail, he went from the womb to the tomb and back to the womb. And I'd have to be able to decipher that, to put that in a poem. And I immediately got what he was talking about. And this idea of being in the womb is that he is rebirthing himself, even in a jail cell, even while incarcerated and surrounded by four walls. It's an opportunity to make himself over within that moment, to go in himself, to find that voice that is muted, that is silent, even while incarcerated, and pull that out from inside of him. So there's so many symbolisms because of what Yusef talks about. And the art part, if we were going to make him, we decided to make him an artist because Yusef is an artist. And I don't know if hopefully at some point during our travels, when we share this book with the country, we'll be able to see Yusef's artwork as well. And there was that moment when he was on Oprah, where Oprah was asking all the young men, the Exonerated Five, how did they deal? How did they cope? And Yusef was the only one who said that he meditated. And people watching it were like, well, of course he meditated. But I don't think they knew. I didn't realize what that meant until I saw his artwork. And because there were no art supplies there was this painstaking process to get the colors down, to get shapes down without art supplies. So I had to think about ways to juxtapose this sort of art making versus the art making that children are taught in school. The art making where you don't have access to fine art or the classics. What is it that you do to make something out of nothing? So some of the poems are based on classical art pieces like Salvador Dali's Persistence of Memory and Pablo Picasso's Guernica. And it's my way of just kind of subverting classical art and also classical literature and anything classical, to let young people know that even if they don't know what these classics are, they have the tools and the wherewithal to create masterpieces. And that's what Yusef did with nothing. And that's what our young people need to know, even if they're not in the best schools, even if they're not in the best situations, they can still create masterpieces, and they do not have to have the classics as their foundation.
Love that.
Yeah.
Now, because I already know that this book is going to be taught in schools, I want to ask you both, like, what books for any age, or what movies or films or anything like that would you pair it with? Would you suggest?
Wow. I'll come up with the poetry.
Okay.
Wow.
They're good together.
They're phasing, yeah.
You know, I think what's great is that we are in this space right now where we're almost discovering all of these things that are classics, right? That are brilliant, that are amazing. When you talk about the artwork, I just literally pulled out these pants that happen to be, these are the pants that I was arrested in. These are the pants that I wore on that famous night that we were accused of raping the jogger. And as a boy who has been over the height of 6 feet since I was 12 years old with a flat top, I was very highly recognizable with this on, right? I mean, both front and back, just designs, just my stuff that I would do. And I think that we're in this space now where we're like wanting to know about books like The Spook Who Sat by the Door, books like the ISIS Papers, books like anything with Dr. Angela Davis, of course, the new Jim Crow, a lot of that stuff I think is important because we're talking about you almost rediscovering, for those people that are so used to watching movies, rediscovering sitting down and picking up a book, and even if you don't have a dictionary with you at the same time, you can at least take out your phone and quickly look up words just to understand those things that you may not, recognize. Like we both come from this, we were blessed, Ibi and I, to be students of a professor who was the protege of Dr. John Henry Clark, who wrote this masterful work called Urugu. Man, I needed like a book thicker than this to understand just the language of it all, because there was so many layers in that. Now is the time to learn. Now is the time to regroup, to reorient yourself, to realize that as you begin to emerge out of this, that should be an emergence of you understanding you are a change agent. You've come here and you've been granted, so to speak, this second lease on life to be able to do something. And it's what you do that makes all of the difference.
Both, I want to add to what Yusef said. We both come from, in college, we lived in independent bookstores. I don't know if you remember Human Bookstore, Revolution Books in Harlem, Inkuru Books in Brooklyn. And this was at a time when Harlem was lined with book vendors. They were the book hustlers, and they would have tables out with books. And part of our learning was looking for literature outside of the ones that were being taught in the classrooms. And I lived in bookstores so much that I ended up working in a bookstore. It was not an independent bookstore. I worked at Walden Books for three years. And I would leave Walden Books to go to Inkuru and Human Books to find the books that I needed. And fortunately, we're living in a time when the books that we had to go seek out, Yusef, are in the bookstores now.
Yeah.
Books like New Jim Crow. I cannot believe that Stamped from the Beginning is something, it's all the things that we were learning in college, and it's mainstream, and it's on the New York Times bestseller list.
Wow.
And there's a young people's version called Stamped with Jason Reynolds and Ibram X. Kendi. So that all that information in that book is stuff that we were learning 20, 25 years ago. Of course, I said Long Way Down by Jason Reynolds is definitely a read-alike. Monster, you can read Punching the Air after you've read Monster. And I like to think of this book, you can also read it for craft and the language and the beauty of language. And I would pair it with Poet X, because both those books are about artists trying to find their voice, and artists being muted and silence for a number of reasons. And any other book that's covers the prison industrial complex for young readers. I know This Is My America by Kim Johnson is coming out in July. And for even younger readers, From the Desk of Zoe Washington by Janae Marks came out in January, and it's about a younger girl who's looking for answers when her father is incarcerated. And there are different avenues that young people can go to fully understand the prison industrial complex and to understand what it means to be a boy trying to find his voice, or a child.
That's great. Since you have all of these booksellers listening who are all around the country, what would you like them, when they're in the store and they have your book, how would you like them to hand sell it? Or who would you like them to give it to? Everyone.
Everybody.
Everyone. What would you ask them to, or, if you were them, what would you say?
I need booksellers and readers to really look at this book in a way that doesn't further dehumanize the character in the story, which is to say, I need readers and booksellers and teachers and librarians to see this book to see the story as a human story, and to hand it to any child who is struggling with just about anything. While Amal is really incarcerated, that is a very real experience for him, in the same way that it was a real experience for Yusef. There are other children who are kind of trapped in the prisons of their own making, right? This could be, environments that are not healthy, home lives that are not healthy. Even if they live a wonderful life in the suburbs, maybe they are going through internal traumas and self-esteem issues, and having, maybe mental health issues, even if it's dealing with sexuality, anything that they are dealing with, they can pick up this book and see themselves in Amal, because Amal is in the between the proverbial rock and a hard place. And this could be for any child dealing with anything. Those walls that they put up around them, or those walls that are put up by others around them, can be real or imagined. And I really, really would want booksellers, librarians, teachers to sell this book in a way that lets readers know that this is a human story, and that lets us know, I'm talking about African-American creatives, that our stories don't have to be relegated to just race books or social justice books. This is a book about art, and this is a book about a child, period. Period. The young people say that.
And it's a book that has hope. It's a hopeful book too, which I think is really important.
We could not write the story if it was just, pain and trauma all up through the end, because that is not Yusef's experience. There is something that happens in the end, not in the end of the story, but over the course of 7 years, 13 years, 30 years, where there have been pockets of hope. And this is the ultimate reconciliation for Yusef and me, where we can finally tell this story. Because while I didn't live through what Yusef lived through, I grew up in New York City, where every other year, there was a tragedy, very much like the tragedies were experienced in this country. I can remember the name of a boy who was fatally killed or was in some racial incident on the news ever since I was 6 years old, and I could name them all. And this is just me. This was cathartic for me. This was letting it out, and this was an opportunity for Yusef to tell a different version of his story.
Yeah.
I think they probably want to turn to questions at this point. I think that's a great place to leave it all, although we could talk for much longer, but maybe people want to ask some questions. Should we go over?
Sure.
Sure. Here I am with my masterpiece theater background. I'm in my in-law house in the country. We have a couple of great questions. So I think we're going to start with the one that's at the top with 4 votes. So Pam Gardow from Wisconsin asks, can you talk about crafting a novel in verse as opposed to a more traditional novel? What makes it harder or easier?
This was easier for me because I needed to give it lots of emotional weight. And poetry is a tool that allows us to do that very well. There's a poem where I needed to reveal to the reader that this was a racial violence that happened. And I didn't want to just say that the victim was white and the assailant is Black. I needed to slowly peel away at that truth with some rhythm, with some visuals. So the theme that's played throughout the whole book is this idea of black and white illustrations. And I wanted to just kind of convey what it means to be in a literal white space and what white space means for the artist or the writer. And the most perfect way to do that was through symbolism and poetry and the lyrical language of poetry and hip hop too.
Can you address the importance of allowing youth access to books such as this, dealing with what might be perceived by cautious parents as so-called adult content, as well as how books geared toward youth can be important reads for adults, especially when these youth and adults then discuss the content that they read?
So I can speak to the idea that this has adult content. I want to remind booksellers here, who will also be readers, this plays into this idea that because it's about a Black child dealing with violence, that there is adult content, and to remind readers that the protagonist is a child, and children go through these things. And this does not make children going through adult issues, doesn't make the child an adult. The child is still a child. And that is why I write for young adults and children, to remind the world that there are children going through hard things, but they are still children. And I think I encourage you all to read the book and, decide what you think is adult content. And also remember that this is still a child. And it's more about Amal finding his voice through art than it is about crime, or than it is about his incarceration. Do you want to add anything to that, Yusef?
Yeah, I think that the important part about that as well is in terms of what you said, is that our children are exposed to so much, and they go through so much. And part of what this book addresses as well is that, yes, this is a child who is experiencing life in a very wrong way. And how do you write that kind of thing? And then also, at the same time, too, there's so many others that go through life like this, whether they've been adjudicated by a system that wants to see them as a part of the slavery, the new Jim Crow kind of thing that Michelle Alexander talks about, and it becomes important to be able to look at that and see and figure out as well, as parents look at it, maybe first, to then pass it on to their children, how they navigate in this space of where America is right now, how they navigate as they see children maybe moving and maneuvering throughout America, how this can speak to that as well.
I was thinking we would move on to this question that addresses the insightful nature of the book and music and hip hop. And that is, my customers love playlists to go along with their reading when the authors are musicians and poets. Could you each suggest or recommend a song for us? Could you each recommend a song for us to suggest when they purchase this title? Does that put you on the spot?
We're in our 40s and we're moms and dads. But I guarantee you that Punching the Air is youthful and is, young readers of today will be able to connect with it. And the language is not antiquated. Right. So I don't know anything that's out today. I think my own teens will have to remind me. But I can say Kendrick Lamar, who won what did he win? Was it the Pulitzer? He won a big prestigious award for the work that he does. So anything by Kendrick Lamar. Who do you say, Yusef?
I was actually going to say Kendrick as well. Any conscious hip hop artist is important, and throw a little bit of the other stuff in too as well. Got to mix it up, got to keep it kind of cool and hip. But, Kendrick being one of the forerunners of today in terms of conscious hip hop is so important, You know, the way that words are shaped and ideas are shaped, and also stepping out on a limb and kind of doing things a little bit different, I think is important as well, which is cool. You know, yeah. Yeah, I mean,
You know, right.
Listen to Nas, right?
Yeah. I want to add that because we're of a certain age and we're from New York City where hip hop started, there was a time when there was a dichotomy in hip hop where it was conscious hip hop and commercial hip hop or materialistic hip hop. And when I first started speaking with Yusef, he said a phrase that was common in our childhood growing up in hip hop was black medallion, no gold. And black medallion, a black medallion was a leather pendant with the Africa symbol. And I just saw that on Yusef's pants. And at the time when we were teenagers and I was in middle school, that was a symbol that was very much like the fist in the Black Lives Matter movement. And that was our Black Lives Matter movement in our song. So there were rappers who sang about very political things. And then there were rappers who talked about money and girls, right? And as a young person, you had to pick a side, very much like East Coast, West Coast. Yeah. And we want to share that with young people to remind them, like, there were two different factions here. And it was the kind of hip hop where you had to read books so you could expand your vocabulary. So your lyricism was that much more advanced. And then the kind of hip hop where you wanted money, right? And we were both from that tradition of just like, we want to be able to think when we listen to music. So when Yusef says conscious hip hop, we're thinking the rappers who would be out now who are saying something with their music and saying something with their content. And one of those people is Kendrick Lamar. I know there are others who are more underground, but we are more underground hip hop than commercial hip hop. So just letting young people know that before Biggie and Tupac, there was conscious and materialistic hip hop. And that's a very New York thing. So Amal is a updated version of Yusef in that there's a line when he says he's more Kendrick than Blueface, and Blueface is a rap. The young people know. I just happen to know, and I put it in there to show that dichotomy that he thinks he's about something. He believes that he prefers the more highbrow lyricism of Kendrick Lamar versus what other people would call mumble rap, what parents like us would call mumble rap. Thank you. Awesome. That was a great question.
Yeah, thank you for asking that one. Speaking of recommendations, Terry M. from Iowa asks, what are you reading right now? What upcoming or recent releases are you the most excited about?
I am excited about This Is My America by Kim Johnson. I really want to see what she does with the prison industrial complex YA novel from a young woman's perspective. The excitement that Stamped is out in the world will never die, because the content of that book is will be the foundation for everything that I write and will be the foundation for Punching the Air. To understand how these ideas have played out in our society, in our culture, makes writing stuff like Punching the Air that much easier. Because I could always say, remember that part in Stamped when they talked about how this idea of Black men and Black girls are viewed as less than human. That was an idea that started by such and such in the year such and such, so I'm always going to shout out that book. And I am excited to see what others are doing with this idea of prison reform activists and young people.
Yeah, I read a lot of religious books. I read a lot of inspirational books. Like right now, I'm looking at this particular book right here, Speeches That Changed the World, because I find a lot of inspiration in stuff that was and how we move forward. Because one of the things that really impressed me was a statement from Dr. Maya Angelou. not Dr. Maya Angelou, I'm sorry, a statement from Angela Davis, Dr. Angela Davis. And what she said was that we as a people have historical amnesia. And I've always suspected, even though I've never asked her this before, but I've always suspected that part of that historical amnesia comes from the way we've been socialized. Sometimes we've been socialized not to know, not to remember, not to dive deep into past lectures, past experiences, past conversations to figure out a way forward, right? And what is interesting about yesterday is how much of today is wrapped in yesterday. How it seems like we're repeating a lot of the same things, same issues that we have to grow through in order to change the world. And the great thing about now is that it seems like it's pulsating at a different level. The whole globe is responding in a way that hasn't been seen before.
Yeah.
And that could be because of social media. That could be because of, we're just ready. The stars are aligning.
I forgot to pull out this book. I'm rereading it because so many people are suggesting Octavia Butler now. So I'm rereading Parable of the Sower so I can discuss it with my teen daughters, and I'm introducing it to them, and I have to remember what's in the book. So this is what I'm reading now. I forgot to answer that question. Parable of the Sower by Octavia Butler. Very timely.
I know a bookseller in the audience who is a total advocate for that book, and you just made a huge fan by saying that. Shout out to Riley. There's about 2 more questions left, so I'm going to sort of put these together, I think, or 3, and I'm going to put them together into 2. People are a little bit interested in craft and how it is that you two came to work together more specifically. But here's a specific question about that, and that's actually from Riley. Maybe somebody voted on it and it moved. Riley asks, what went into the decision to take what could have been a YA memoir or biography and instead create fictional characters in this very real circumstance and experience? Was there ever a thought to make this a biography or memoir?
Yeah, absolutely. I don't think we ever talked about that because it's like, water under the bridge. But that was the first thing that we wanted to do. I didn't approach them and say, let's write about a fictional 16-year-old. It was like, I want to tell your story. I want to help you tell your story because I remember your story. I met you. I was in New York City at the time. I watched it on TV in the 6th grade. I want to help you tell your story because I was a former journalist, and it was going to be Yusef's story as a member of Central Park 5 before the Netflix series and before they were renamed the Exonerated Five. But unfortunately, I can tell them. It's okay, right? Yeah. Unfortunately, I didn't know. We were all set to go to write his story, but he was under contract to not share his story because the Netflix movie was underway. So it was a contractual thing where he could not write about his story because Ava DuVernay and her team owned the rights for a number of years. And the only way that he could write a book is if he made it fictional and inspired by his story, but not the Central Park 5 jogger case. So it's Hollywood mumbo jumbo, Hollywood jargon and all of that.
Well, and Riley has a follow-up question. Will Yusef start writing more YA fiction after this?
Yusef?
Yeah.
I'm just being introduced to this, and I think it's great. I would love to continue on. Maybe me and Ibi might.
Maybe.
Well, we are here for it. We will be watching.
Yeah.
I feel like there's maybe 2 questions left because there's a very specific one from Chris Kleindienst from Left Bank in St. Louis. She wants to know, Yusef, you use meditation to fortify yourself. Was there a particular form of meditation that was especially helpful, and how did you discover it? A very of the times kind of question.
So it wasn't necessarily a specific meditation, meaning this one or that one. It was the way of meditation. It was almost like here I was being instructed by my grandmother, family, friends, really people that cared. And they were talking to me about prayer. And they were saying, make sure that I continue to pray. Because in the context of what I was doing, it was understood that prayer was when you talk to God. But they also said, always meditate, always open up your mind and heart to that stillness that you need in order to grow through this, because meditation is when God talks back. And so it was that process of understanding that it had to kind of go hand in hand, and it had to work itself and massage itself. And it wasn't something that you could just kind of snap your fingers and be done with it. But because you had time, you had to be able to turn time into a tool, right? They say that either you can allow time to do you, or you can do the time. And if you allow time to do you, you become out worse. You come out bitter and not better. But if you do the time, you can turn time into something magnificent. I used to meditate in such a way where I would marry my visions with what it would feel like. And I think that was one of the keys that I found, right? The secret key, that if you are able to visualize success and then marry that vision with the actual thought of what it would feel like to have that, then you can call it into existence. Your focus and your movement will be almost laser sharp, and everything else would just fall to the wayside because you know what it is that you want.
All of that is in the book. There's even a poem called Meditation.
Yeah.
Because I had asked him that question in another way, and he gave me a similar answer. I'm like, okay, how do I put that in poetry form? And I hope I captured that very well. And there are illustrations in the book. It is illustrated.
Yeah.
Wonderful. You two are an amazing pair, and I wasn't sure if I should ask this, what I felt like totally advanced, challenging, off-the-cuff question, but let's go for it. Larry asks, do you have any thoughts on how 2020, in regards to months of shelter in place, followed by a worldwide civil rights movement, will change how authors write and what readers want to read?
Wow.
I don't think we could have ever imagined that this book. So there's conversations about abolishing a law enforcement and abolishing a prison system. And I went back. So there's a character in the book who is a prison abolitionist. And I went back and forth thinking it's maybe too radical. And I was afraid to put her in there. And I went, and there is a difference between prison reform and prison abolition. And I studied, and it was in the new Jim Crow. And I just did my research and compared the two. And either this art teacher is going to be, a kind of just a watered down version of that sort of activism, or do I make her radical? And I'm like, okay, let's push the envelope. Let's make her radical. Let me put prison abolition in this book. And look, people are talking about it. It's been mentioned in the New York Times. Yeah. I'm like, whoa, here I was fretting over it, thinking it's radical. And now there are conversations about radical movements happening. And in the way that Yusef meditates to, everything that he just said about meditation. And I'm thinking, did you conjure me, Yusef? I think you conjured this whole thing, right? Not in terms of what's happening in the world, but how the serendipity of how we came together to write this book. And there are so many things I wanted to say that I put in the book as well. So it is all of me and all of Yusef. And it's just very fascinating that it's, coming to a head now after a pandemic, after, this civil unrest that is happening. So I can't believe, and you may not have already read the book. We wrote it together. I can't believe how timely it is. Yeah. It sounds very cliche, but it is. It is very timely in talking about, it's not a police brutality. It's not about pandemic. It's about how children are coping with what's happening now. Yeah. Here's a child who felt he was alone at what was happening to him. And there are children right now during shelter in place who feel very alone, even though the world is going through the same thing. When they're connecting through the internet, but they're not seeing their friends. So they feel incredibly alone and they feel trapped by four walls. So yes, it's timely in so many different ways. Mhm.
Well, I think it's time to start. We got a ditto. That's good. I think it's time to start wrapping up, but I have a question in there that I'm wondering if we could go out on, and that's hopefully not putting you on the spot. Would you be able to read something from the book as we end the event?
Who's gonna read? I'll read, but I'll have to go get it.
Okay.
I don't have a copy with me.
Yeah,
I'll get it.
I want you
I'm
to
2 minutes away.
You could just read a great speech in the meantime from your book, right?
Well,
I'm back.
Okay, what I was thinking about really quickly was how everything matters. I think what this experience has showed us, especially because I think everyone alive now, with the exemption of those who are very, very elderly, who might have experienced the Spanish flu or something like that, this is brand new for everyone. And how everything matters at this moment in time. People are trying to figure out how to survive, how to figure out what this thing is. And I don't know, my light is actually going a little crazy. There you go. Let me just turn it off. They're trying to figure out how do you survive the next pandemic, right? That's what people are really thinking about. Like this is the new normal. And so moving into the future is like, this shifted all of us. This shifted us into this new space of, oh my goodness, everything matters. I am here to do something. What is that something that I have to do? And it's the question, right? It's the trying to figure out that answer to the question. You know, they say that, I think it's Nietzsche who says, if you can find the why, you can live anyhow. And I think it's important to be able to look at it from that perspective. Like even when I was in prison, finding that why, finding I'm supposed to be here. There's something that I'm supposed to get. These scars that are indelible are building me some way, somehow. And here we are 31 years later with this masterpiece.
Do you still want me to read a page or as we go out?
We sure do.
Okay, so I'm not going to read from the beginning. I'm just going to read something that's in the moment right now. This poem is called Dust, and it's in the middle of the book. And I'm reading it because it's a conversation between Amal and his mother. Dust. They can't kill you in here, but they will try, Umi says from across the round table. That's the point. Locking you up isn't enough for them. They will try to crush your spirit until you're nothing but dust, we both say together. And what does dust do, Amal? What did Maya Angelou say about dust? Umi asks. It rises, I whisper. You gotta say it loud enough for me to hear it, baby. Loud enough for you to believe it. Dust rises, I say, loud enough for it to ring in my own ears. She takes both my hands and squeezes them, but I pull away from her. Don't call me baby, not here, not now, I say loud enough for her to hear. Those guys didn't touch my face, so she doesn't know how my insides have already turned to dust, and it can't rise because it's trapped here in my belly. Amal, no matter how tall you grow, no matter how thick your beard, no matter how deep the bass in your voice, you were first my baby boy, grown into a young man, growing into a man, becoming an elder, transitioning into an ancestor, evolving into spirit, turning into breath, easing into life. You are my life, and you are life itself, Amal. That's it.
A round of applause.
Wow. Yeah.
Thank you both so much for your remarkable energy. You make us feel like we're all in.
Thank you.
Definitely we are. See, but we are all in together.
Nice.
Speaking of the book, the last thing I wanted to say is that galleys are a marketing request from our publishers who are the support of our industry. And booksellers meet their good energy and go out and make a lot of noise, read this book, put up blurbs, tag the publisher, tag the authors, tag us. Let's make a lot of noise and work together on a better future.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye now.
Bye-bye.